Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And my guest today is Hanna Diamond, Professor of French History at Cardiff University, whose latest book, Josephine Baker's Secret War, is out now. Here's my copy. And you can get your copy from the links below or your favorite bookstore. And just because we've already discussed Josephine Baker a couple of times before, it's going to be a looser chat today. We're going to talk about her legacy, whether the perceptions of her as a groundbreaker in so many fields have changed over the 80 years since World War II. So we'll do that. So I'll bring Hanna in now. Good evening. How are you today?
Hello, Paul. Sorry, there's a real echo on this link.
I'm
having a bit of trouble.
Have you got YouTube open as well? No?
No, I haven't. I've only got you open.
But you've got an echo.
Okay, it's better now. It's better now. It's settled down.
We love it when we have gremlins at the beginning of the show. So Josephine Baker, we were just talking about her, Hanna. I mean, what an incredible legacy in so many different areas. We've got some pictures and things, but before we get into Josephine Baker, how do you define yourself in terms of researcher, storyteller, history? Obviously, you teach French history, but do you have a label you like to give yourself?
I don't know. I suppose I am a researcher, really, an academic researcher, but my work on Josephine Baker, I mean, she's such an appealing figure, and I really was very taken with her. I actually stumbled across her unexpectedly, and I felt I have written other books that I suppose are a little bit more academic than this one, but I felt that this was a story that deserved to be told in a really accessible way. There's a real strong narrative story, as well as some really interesting conclusions we can draw out about it, about the woman she was. And yeah, she's a bit of an icon, really. So I was trying to understand not just her war story, but also how the war impacted on her post-war life and all the other things she got up to. So yeah, I think, a researcher is probably right.
And, we talk about Churchill having written however many millions of words he wrote about his own life. And Josephine Baker, whether she ever were to write her own story or other people writing her story, I mean, you could fill volumes. I mean, you could do volumes on just one aspect, the groundbreaking role she had in terms of being a person of color in the era she was. We could talk about the wartime side. There's the music, there's the dance, there's the people she knew. You could just do an entire book on the people she shook hands with and had conversations with. I mean, she lived through so much of the 20th century's biggest changes, and we'll talk about that, and your book talks about that, because so many different eras she had her feet in, different perceptions of her as who she was. But now, we were talking before going live, she's arguably best known now for her role in World War II, but there was an era when that really wasn't known. I mean, because her work was secret. So before we get into some of the conclusions, how difficult is it or easy is it these days to research someone who was, below the surface, so to speak, in World War II? Anybody who was doing things that were covert, there's a secrecy. So is it easy these days to find information?
Well, I think, I stumbled into this a little bit in terms of not being a great expert initially in intelligence history, and you are shadowboxing a bit. You're sort of trying to find the various bits of the puzzle that will make sense. And actually, there is a story behind this too. I happened to be in France just at the beginning of this journey during the Panthéonisation ceremonies in November 2021, and Macron made quite a big deal about Josephine Baker's war service as being a reason for this, giving Josephine Baker this great honor. In case your viewers aren't aware, it's this symbolic transfer of ashes to this mausoleum in Paris, which is full of very distinguished men.
I mean, really, you don't get there unless you've been an absolute world changer.
But it is very male. And the fact that Macron chose Josephine Baker was quite remarkable, because she was African-American, because obviously she wasn't a French native born. She took French nationality, and she was the first performer as well. So, this was a huge deal by any means. So there I was, And Macron had said, you know, her war service was very important. She'd obviously been this great entertainer in the interwar period and a very important civil rights activist after the war. But there was this big gap in our knowledge about the Second World War and what she'd been up to then. So I was kind of, somehow word got out that I was doing this research project, and I was having to field these journalists, you know, what did she do? And how do we, you know, why is there so little information about it? And I was a little panicked because, you know, I was at the beginning of the project and slightly suffered from imposter syndrome. But then as the months went by and I got into the French archives and I got to America and looked in the military archives, and I sort of trawled every memoir I could find, and I used the press a lot as well, the press of the time. The African-American press was actually very helpful because she was so important to the African-American community. They would run articles all the time about where she was and what she was doing. And she liked nothing better than to sit down with a journalist and chat on about what she was thinking and doing. And I was able to kind of cross-reference, work out where she was and when, and sort of anchor in some of these second sources, sort of cross-referencing some of the stuff that is said in her memoirs that have actually just been translated into English and published in the UK by Penguin, which anyone who looks at them will understand she indulges in quite a few flights of fancy. She's got a bit of a tendency to embellish, for want of a proper way of putting it. And another key source is this one, if you want to just show people, Paul.
Yep.
This is a book by Jacques Abté, who it is actually the same title. I pinched his title, Josephine Baker's Secret War. But he wrote this in 1948. He was her handler.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this is the most complete account of her work. But it isn't always reliable. And he's using his stories about her to sort of make himself shine as well, which is a little bit inevitable, I suppose, with memoirs. So what I wanted to do was take these memoirs and, as I said before, cross-check them with other sources from other ends. And I think I did manage to build up a picture. But to get back to your question, although Josephine Baker is really, I think, quite well known in France, particularly since pantheonization, and this period of her life is, I think, relatively new to people. I think she's less known here in the UK, and in the US, she's very well known as an African-American icon, and really as a civil rights activist. You know, she was one of 2 women to speak at the March of Washington in 1963, in the lead up to Martin Luther King's great speech, I Have a Dream speech. So people tend to know her more for that. So, yeah, I think it's where you are and where you're looking at this from depends how you will understand Josephine Baker better, I think, according to that.
Yeah, and another thing that leads on from what you were saying there is that when we've talked about some of the other famous figures from SOE or OSS or other spies working for both the Allies and the Axis, they're living in the shadows. They're everything they were doing was underground and undercover. The thing about Josephine Baker is particularly, the aspect we're talking about her war years is that it was, to some extent, she was in the public. She was a public figure. She used her notoriety, her fame to do this stuff. But as you say, that then means that she would be hiding behind a kind of a web of intrigue behind the public thing. So as a researcher, as you said there, with looking at the accounts and things, the embellishments, the white lies to cover what she's really doing, it might be harder in some ways researching a public figure than it is a person who was completely behind the covers, because then you're dealing with what was real, what was part of the cover story, and what was part of the truth. And that must have been a fascinating process. But I guess you did have the movements. You did know for most of it where she was, I assume.
Yes, you do. You can track where she is. And you're quite right. Yes, her celebrity. I mean, even Jacques Abté, who was told that she would be a wonderful person to help him in counter-espionage, was a little, unimpressed with the idea initially, because here's this huge star, and she had a bit of a reputation for being rather eccentric. She would walk down the Champs-Élysées with her a pet cheetah on a lead, and the cheetah actually was a male cheetah, although it was called Chiquita, somewhat counterintuitively. And yes, wherever she went, she was followed by floods of journalists. So when she was suggested to him as someone who could possibly help him with the collection and transmission of intelligence, he was a little taken aback. And of course, also the French had been a little bit stung by their experience with Matahari, and that hadn't ended very well at all, and she also had been a performer. So it was only when he actually met her in person and, found that she was this, I suppose he saw her without all the trimmings of this celebrity in her wonderful home in Le Vessinet, where she was living, and with this huge animal menagerie. I mean, she did have these odd eccentricities, but he was very moved by the way in which she talked about her love of France. And, she married a Frenchman, Jean Lyon, who was Jewish actually in 1937, and she took French nationality then and renounced her American nationality. And she really embraced that. She sort of distanced herself really from the US. She'd had a very disappointing tour in 36, and she sort of decided, France is my home. So when war loomed, unlike all the other African Americans, and there were a lot of African Americans in Paris between the wars, there was a huge interest in all things to do with jazz and African
jazz
art.
And swing, and
But when it became clear that Hitler was threatening war, and the American embassy did warn them that they could be particularly targeted. Of course, the Nazis were terrible racists, and most of them left. I mean, all of them left, really. And Josephine Baker said, no, I'm going to stay. I am French now. I'm going to stay with my compatriotes, with my fellow citizens, and support them. And I think when she talked about this to Jacques Abté, and she said, I want to do what I can to pay back this huge debt that I owe the French, because the French had made her famous, particularly the Parisians, and she'd experienced this incredible fame that she couldn't even have dreamt of at home in the US under segregation. It was a very different world, and very difficult for African American performers to really establish themselves. And she noticed that as soon as she arrived, how different life was in France. So I think that's what clinched it for Abté. He gave her a go, and her networks were amazing. I mean, she could swan around and go where she wanted, and she'd be invited into embassies, and people would talk to her indiscreetly because they were a bit starstruck, and it never occurred to them that she could be using any information they gave her. And already in 1939, when Abté and his counterintelligence unit were trying to find out what were the Italian ambitions in the war, what were the Japanese hoping to gain, he was able to report back on what these diplomats had said, and he realized that, she really had something to offer him. So I think her celebrity played in her favor in terms of the networks of the contacts she was able to access. And similarly, later in the war, she ends up going to Morocco, and she spends some time with Casablanca. And we all know from the wonderful film, don't we, that Casablanca was really this nest of incredible underground espionage activity, across the board, not just the Vichy spies, but the budding Gaullist spies. And we had, you've got the Italian presence, the German presence, the Spanish presence, and of course later on you've also got the Americans and some SOE, but less so perhaps. And there she was, invited everywhere. And in particular, she was adopted by the local Moroccans, some of whom were very powerful. I'm thinking in particular of Tami El Galawi, who was the Sultan of the South, who sort of took her under his wing. And she was able, through these networks, to have privileged access to people and to information. I think so that the networks is the one element of her celebrity that was so useful. The second element was her ability to travel, Paul.
Yeah.
Because we're in a war period. Borders are closed. It's very difficult for people to get around. But when Josephine Baker applies for a visa, saying she's going to organize a concert tour, she needs to go to Lisbon, everyone gives her the stamp she needs, and she's able to get passage. Now, Abte travelled with her initially, but quite quickly he fell under suspicion, and he wasn't able always to accompany her. I mean, when he could, she was the most wonderful cover for him, and he was able to sweep through borders. Nobody paid any attention to him because Josephine Baker was there, and everyone went wild trying to get her autograph and so on. But she also did some trips on her own. She went to Portugal, she went to Spain, and under cover of her concert tours, she gave concerts. She was able to travel and bring information back to those that needed it. And I think, you know, she took some really significant risks. She was very brave because, you know, she talks about writing notes and hiding them on her person and in her clothes. And she says, you know, no one would ever dare to search Josephine Baker. And no one did. And she was lucky. But if they had, you know, she would have been in big trouble.
Well, so, she knew how to play her with her charms, her wit. And I was just thinking, as you were saying there, a chameleon's maybe not quite the word, but she's everywhere she goes, she allows them to kind of project onto her what they wanted to be. So she's a hero for people of color. She's a hero for women. She's a hero for the French, but she doesn't, although, as you said, she did adopt French citizenship. She plays her Americanness when she needs to, you know, when she, you know, especially in the kind of period when the USA is neutral and things like that. So she's very good at fitting in. And do you think that was a skill she got basically the minute she left the USA and she started traveling? She had to work on her wits and how to fit in, because she's a fish out of water until she learns the language and becomes a real francophile. But do you think she got those skills of just fitting in very, very early in her life?
I think she did. But let's not forget that she came to Paris. She was 19 in 1925. I mean, she was very young, and she wasn't very educated. She left school early. She came from this very, very deprived background. I mean, she was born in St. Louis in the backdrop of race riots and single mother. Her father left the home very early on. Her mother took him washing, put her into service with white families, very young. She looked after children. She cleaned their houses, and she was ill-treated. And she managed to come out of that background actually by marrying very young. Her first marriage was at 13. But she built a life for herself. She danced and she got herself noticed, and she got to Broadway against all the odds. You know, she had grit. And when she was selected to come to Paris, I mean, you know, she was amazed at what she found in Paris, but she didn't stand still. She had this kind of extraordinary overnight success, and that was to do with the way she danced, which both pleased and shocked everyone, but it made her the talk of the town, a kind of overnight celebrity. But she didn't stand still. She continued to improve herself. She was clever. She met the great and the good. She was adored by the surrealists. You know, people designed for her. And she learned, well, she was influenced very much by her first partner, Pepito Albertino, who knew how to market her. He helped her, you know, in advertising and so on. He helped her also learn to sing, and she became a music hall star and a film star. So I think what impresses me most about Josephine Baker is her capacity to reinvent herself.
Yeah.
She goes from being dancer to music hall star, and then to becoming a performer for the French, and she uses that as a cover to become a really competent spy. And then she goes on to become a troupe performer.
Yeah.
And that becomes, you know, I read some of the letters from the servicemen who went to her concerts, and she was extremely effective and moving and supported them incredibly. And then, you know, they were so impressed with her ability to rouse the crowds in favor of the resistance, in favor of de Gaulle. She went on this mad trip. If you want to show people, Paul, this trip she went on from, she was based in Marrakesh, and with Ante in jeeps, they did 2 jeeps. They did this extraordinary journey all across North Africa through to the Middle East, to Egypt, where she did performances that were propaganda in favor of de Gaulle and the Free French and raising money for them. Though at this stage in the war, obviously after Operation Torch, we're now in 1943, she's also working undercover, still doing espionage, this time for de Gaulle, because de Gaulle is very uneasy about what's going on in his French Empire, and in particular in the Levant, in Lebanon and in Syria. So Josephine Baker, under cover of these trips, is able to meet the local British troops who are there, find out what's going on. Of course, the British are also starting to maneuver for the post-war colonial order. And, you know, in some ways they were playing it a little bit dirty, it has to be said, particularly in Syria and Lebanon. And she was able then to use this information that she collected about how these local Muslim populations were thinking and who they would support back to de Gaulle. But here she was also performing to Allied troops of all colours, you know, and being the most, almost a kind of Vera Lynn figure, if you like, bringing comfort and support to these servicemen. So she was remarkable. She's so multifaceted and multi-layered in her contribution. And as a result of this trip and the extraordinary amount of money she was able to raise, she was put in uniform. And I think I've got a picture here. Yes. She became a propaganda officer from May 1944. Lieutenant, she was actually a second Lieutenant Baker. And here we see her. She knew how to fly. She was a pilot. So she became a member of the Auxiliary French Air Force. And here you see her with Major Alain Dumanil, who was her superior officer, her commandant, as the French say, and who's actually was a really interesting source for me to use, because I saw in the archives some of her interviews and some of her notes about, you know, it was quite something, I think, having to manage Josephine Baker. But Josephine Baker mucked in, you know, when she was in the barracks, she would get up at 4 a.m. and she would clean the floor along with all the women in the barracks there. But she would also be given leave to go and entertain and do all the other things she did to try and promote de Gaulle. So, yeah, she sort of was actually a superb propaganda icon for de Gaulle and for the French resistance, on top of everything else.
Yeah, which we'll talk about her motivation in a minute, but just we got a couple of questions, because the minute we start using labels like spies or secret agents or commandos, it does kind of beg this underwatch definition, because, you know, people have the James Bond spy thing, then there's sort of diplomatic spying. So one of the questions we got is, you know, she wore a uniform, she was in the service, but Was she combat trained, for example? So did she get at any point during her career the kind of training people like Violet Szabo got, how to use a fighting knife? I'm assuming not. I'm assuming she's much more working at a different level of the partying spy, as opposed to the in the skulking in the shadows spy. Is that true?
Yeah, she's much more a listen, collect, and pass on type of spy. You know, she's someone who had privileged access, as we said, to networks and information. Yep. For example, when she went to Spain, you know, the Allies were always terrified. Maybe we need to get our map up. If you want to put that map
Yep.
up, you know, the Allies were terrified that Hitler would make a deal with Franco and invade North Africa through French Morocco and take over North Africa. So one of the ambitions was to send Josephine Baker into Spain when she went on her own, to have a good look around, to see if the Germans were present or not, whether there was something going on. And also, of course, Tangier was absolutely key. It was also an area where there was a lot of espionage going on. And the British were very sensitive because Gibraltar was an absolutely crucial position, you know, for the British Navy. So Baker was able to meet people in Tangier. She found herself invited to dinner parties. Again, there were lots of local dignitaries who invited her to dinner, along with Spanish colonels, and she was able to ask them outright, you know, what's going on? Are you talking to the Germans? And she was able to report back this kind of information. Thankfully, nothing was going on, but it could have been. And so that's the kind of spy she was, really.
Yeah.
So it had military importance, but she wasn't the kind of, you know, James Bond type, you know, fighting spy at all. No, not to my knowledge.
Trevor Sheehan, who's our resident Tunisia expert, says American diplomat Kenneth Pindar hosted a pilot party for Josephine in Marrakesh in 1943. He called it the party to end all parties. I mean, it seems that although it's going away from her career a bit, she's the kind of person that people would remember, that, you know, the cliche of kind of lighting up the room when she came in, all eyes on her, center of attention. I mean, she knows that about herself. I mean, we had a question earlier from Gary August about how much does Hanna think she used her dual sexuality to enhance her uncover roles? Because she was a complicated figure in terms of her own personal dynamics and things, but she knows who she is. She knows what effect she has on people, doesn't she?
She does. And I mean, in all honesty, the sources didn't tell me a lot about her dual sexuality, I'm afraid, Gary, but there's no doubt that she had serious star power.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me, I'm trying to find my slide. She was in your colleague, I thought I put it up. There's when she's in the, no, I haven't put it up. When she, perhaps take that down then, Gary. When she's in Morocco, she's able to bring together people from all the different parts of what is going on. You've got the Vichy officers, you've got the Gaullist officers. She's sitting down for dinner. She's the only woman surrounded by officers, surrounded by, there are American officers there. Some of them are African Americans, some of them are white Americans, but there are also these Moroccan dignitaries. And she's the only woman sitting at this table surrounded by these men. And they would have these dinners, and then she'll get up, leave the table, and go into the next door room where all the women are gathered. And they're all desperate to chat to her and talk to her about everything that's going on. So everyone wants to meet Josephine Baker. She's got this kind of power over them, and she uses it to her own advantage. So, yeah, I think that's really important.
Let's talk about motivation, because when we've talked about, for example, SOE agents, so many of them sort of have I'm talking about British ones, they have a British ancestry, a French relative, they grew up in France. Their motivation is often quite clear. They see the threat of the Third Reich. They're serving either for Britain and or France. But Josephine Baker's a little bit different because, as you said, she's now a French national, but during the war, France doesn't technically exist. You know, there are different factions. There's Vichy France, there's the Gaullists, there's, you know, particularly in 42 and 43, no one quite knows where French politics is going to go. No one knows even the outcome of the war at this point. So do you have an idea of what her real motivation was? What did she see as the future? Was it, to just say it was for France seems a bit simplistic. It's for a better France, the best of France, the France you'd experience. What would you put it down to?
Well, the subtitle is that she fought for France and freedom. Is the subtitle of my book. And I mean, Josephine Baker understood the dangers of Nazism.
Yeah.
I mean, she was confronted with it personally.
Yeah.
When she gave concerts there in the late 1920s. She was vilified by the Nazis, who weren't yet in power then. They called her the Black Devil. They heckled in her concerts. And similarly, when she was in Austria. So she understood that she was personally targeted by the Nazis and people like her. She also married a Jewish man. You know, Jean Leon was a Jew, and she was very, very attached to his family. Although the marriage wasn't very successful, they divorced in 1941. She was very attached to his mother and stayed attached to the family for the rest of her life. And actually, I spoke to her son, Brian Baker, and he said that she tried to convert to Judaism, and she felt very close to the Jewish religion, and she carried a Jewish prayer book with her wherever she went. But it's very hard to convert to Judaism, so she didn't go through with the whole thing. But because she was part of this community, she understood the dangers of anti-Semitism. She understood what it would mean if the Nazis were to beat the Allies. So, you know, all these things come together in her commitment to fight, you know, initially for France, but also for her native country, for America.
Yeah.
And she does talk about this. You know, the Americans will come and save us. And when the Americans do invade Casablanca with the Allied, you know, landings, she's absolutely over the moon. She's delighted, you know. So that there is that angle. I also found that there was another angle that I think is really interesting that hasn't been talked about before. I spoke before about the African American press, which I found a really valuable source. And one of the things I uncovered was that when she started singing for the American troops that were present in North Africa, she was immediately confronted again with segregation.
Yeah.
You know, in front of her. You know, she'd left it behind when she left America in 1925. She'd celebrated the freedom she'd experienced and the fame she'd acquired in France. And here she was singing to the American troops who were in North Africa, obviously preparing for the next stages of the war. And she could see that African American servicemen, they weren't treated in the same way. They had to do all the menial tasks. They had to stand at, you know, she insisted on having mixed audiences, and she starts to speak out. She starts to use her platform to try and promote African Americans. And she talks about how proud she is of her race, as she puts it, how she feels her contribution to the war is helping people better to understand the African Americans and their contribution to the war effort. And I think that this is the kind of embryonic beginnings of Baker understanding the power she has to promote African Americans. And she will return to this later on in her post-war life when she has this extraordinary experiment of bringing children together. You know, she adopts 12 children from all over the world and brings them up in, you know, a variety of religious backgrounds to show the world that we can all live together comfortably. She puts them in her chateau in Les Milandes. And it looks a bit eccentric to us now, but she genuinely wanted to get her message across. And in part, this was because she was so disappointed that at the end of the war, segregation didn't come to an end. And she does become more and more active. And she's learned during the war how her performances can be also a platform for her to promote the ideas she believes in.
And that's worth mentioning, the post-war aspect and the work she does, the activism, because as a participant in World War II through her spying, she at least saw the defeat of the Nazis. She saw that come to an end. She was able to witness, the celebrations in Europe in May 45 and things like that. But with her activism, we're still fighting the good fight 80 years on. So she sees changes. She's able to witness the beginning of an effort to bring equality to the USA and other parts of the world, but she doesn't really live long enough to see what she would have really wanted to see in terms of that equality. Well, we're still not there now, I suppose, are we really? But do you think that frustrated her, that she'd achieved so much in World War II, but then after the war, these other things she gets behind don't quite go at the speed she wants to, because she gets her things accomplished quickly. She becomes, you said how she arrives wide-eyed, innocent in Paris, but within, almost hours, she's won them over, and she wins over so many people so many times. But post-war, she's fighting against a lot of establishment. So do you think that would have frustrated her, that she didn't get as far with that as she would have liked to have done?
I'm sure she was frustrated. She was deeply miserable when she couldn't make her wonderful experiment with the children in the Chateau des Milandes work. She went bust eventually, and she puts out lots of appeals to get money, but she can't make that work. And I'm sure it was, but there is a complexity about this post-war period and her battle for civil rights, because although she speaks out very articulately and emotionally and movingly in the post-war period about how we all deserve to live equally, and she talks about the freedom that she experienced in France, and she's very critical of America and the way in which African Americans are treated. She never speaks out about the terrible things that the French do in the wars of decolonization. France was by no means perfect.
No, absolutely not.
Nor were we, of course. But she is so caught up in her support for France, and she really is a very ardent Gaullist. My goodness. She was totally devoted to de Gaulle, really from the get-go, from the first moment she hears about his appel from London in 1940. I saw her post-war correspondence with de Gaulle, and she sent him a telegram every 18th of June saying, your humble servant, Josephine Baker, and he writes courteously back, I so appreciate your support from day one, as it were. But she never really speaks out at all about decolonization. And even during the war, when the Moroccan independence movement declares its aims in early 1944, she says to them, and she says to her friends, no, now is not the time, it's too premature. De Gaulle is your man. You shouldn't be going for independence. And, she tells them to hold back. And I think there is this complexity about her, Paul, that there is a tension there, that she is prepared to compromise. She understands the terms of her acceptance in France, and she embraces that. But it does mean that she is open to attack by Americans in particular, when she's speaking out so vocally about, they're saying, well, look at what's going on in France.
I guess it's just her loyalty to France was just it was there all her life. She found that welcome there in her youth, and I guess it stayed with her. But I want to take it back. Someone asked about whether she was what Vichy thought about her in the early part of the war, 1940 and 41, because the thing about her is she never really kept her mouth shut. She was quite open right from the beginning about, she was sort of careful-ish with the language. She didn't necessarily use labels and names, but it was clear from the beginning she would talk about things like freedom and things like, so it was obvious that she was not going to go through the war saying nothing, because that is something that France is dealing with. Some of its famous stars, Maurice Chevalier, people like that, who just kind of try to just stick their head in the sand in some ways and ignore it all and not say anything about anything and just hope it would all go away. But she very early on kind of shows her cards. So were people suspicious of her? What did people try and shut her up or get rid of her or boot her out or kill her or anything like that in the early part of the war?
Well, she leaves of her own accord. She performs in Paris during the Phony War.
Yeah.
She does a performance with actually Maurice Chevalier. It's a show called Paris London to celebrate the alliance with Britain, and a lot of British officers actually go and see her. There are lots of pictures, and there's an article in Picture Post that unfortunately I can't show you because of copyright, but and she's performing, she's doing all sorts of good works at this point, as well as starting to do some spying for Abte. You know, she's sending packages to soldiers on the front, and yeah, she's volunteering in Red Cross centers. She's really doing.
She's making it obvious that she's whose side she is on in this struggle. Yes. She's not hiding anything.
No.
Where other people are being very, very cagey at the beginning. I mean, you teach French history. I live here. We kind of sometimes think of the kind of the 44 era of France, where everyone seems to be moving in the same direction. But in the early part of the war, France is very unsure about where its future is going, and people are, are going with the flow a little bit more. But she's feisty from the beginning. I mean, I just say she did leave, but she's not keeping quiet about her loyalty.
Well, she leaves. She leaves in June 1940 when it's clear that the Germans are on their way, and she goes to the chateau that she's renting in the Dordogne, which is wonderful, and it's a wonderful museum. I thoroughly recommend it, actually. She refused. She says she will never perform in occupied France. She will never, and she says this to anyone who'll listen to her throughout the war. I left Paris. I would not perform for the Nazis. And she does leave. One of the reasons she leaves, actually, even, she's in Vichy France. She's on, because France is obviously divided into two. There's the occupied zone in the north, and her chateaus in the southern zone, the so-called free zone of Vichy. But Vichy does also ban Black people from the stage, but she flagrantly ignores this ban when she does put on a show in Marseille in around Christmas, New Year, 1940-41. She puts on her La Créole, a show that she'd done in 1935, and really she needed it as a cover. Why would she be in Marseille? She's actually working as an undercover agent at this point, working with Abte, collecting information, passing it on to the British. So she does actually perform in Vichy France, but she is encouraged to leave very quickly and go to the Empire, which is also, North Africa is also under the aegis of Vichy, but it is a kind of lesser presence, if you like.
It is, but there's a lot of stuff going on in North Africa. There are a lot of factions with a lot of different ideas about the future. Those that are both pro the Allies, pro Axis, and kind of opportunists there. But and some people who left Europe, they went to Canada. They literally left and went somewhere where the war wasn't. She doesn't leave the war zone, so to speak. I mean, living in the south of France, in Vichy France, she still could have been, people knocking on the door and taking it away, which leads us to a question from Dennis. Now, you talked about the fact when she was smuggling messages, if she'd been stopped, she was in danger. But when you're talking about a spy, personal danger, we're kind of back to the sort of James Bond idea of, I don't know, running down a railway platform with loads of other agents chasing you, firing machine guns at you. She was never in that obvious kind of danger. But if she had been caught in the role she was doing, she was in danger, wasn't it? What she did was
in danger.
truly dangerous.
And I think she was protected. I think that, she could have been denounced. Anyone could have, exposed her. I was longing in the American archives to find reports by the American spies who were in North Africa at the time, preparing for Operation Torch, undercover of being, the early OSS, undercover of being vice consuls, overseeing trade agreements. And they did meet Josephine Baker. And the story is, she fell very, very ill in July 1941. And she was out of action for months and months and really very near death. I mean, she really did have terrible health. And, we don't know exactly what the problem was, but she had terrible septicemia. But as she recovered, and during those moments of recovery, her hospital room was used as a kind of rendezvous area for ABTE, the French Secret Services, the American OSS officers, and even the Moroccan dignitaries who were sympathetic to meet and exchange as they were preparing Operation Torch. Any of them could have exposed her.
Yeah.
She was protected. And I didn't find, her name was never mentioned in any of the reports I read. About I read everything in the American military archives about North Africa, and her name is never mentioned. But, none of the informers' names are mentioned. All you get is an evaluation of their reliability and their usefulness, A1, A2, B1, B2. And I'd like to think that her name wasn't being mentioned because she was protected. I did come across one account by Lieutenant Paul Jensen of the Counterintelligence Corps, he comes forward in 1951 when Josephine Baker's war record comes under attack by Walter Winchell, who was a radio celebrity at the time. Around the time of the Stork Club debacle, she goes into a Stork Club, and the Stork Club in New York, and she isn't served, and she gets very upset, and there's a whole issue around it that explodes. And Walter Winchell is also in the club. So is Princess Grace of Monaco, incidentally. That's where they first meet. And Walter Winchell starts to attack her and said, you only helped the war effort after the Americans arrived, and your war record has been inflated. So this Lieutenant Paul Jensen comes out and says she risked her life for us.
Yeah.
She gave us information that helped us to secure Morocco, and I got a silver star on the back of that. So, it's very rare to get these kind of accounts by named people.
Yeah.
But there is no doubt that she did risk her life and she was in danger.
Yeah. And this brings me to the next question, really, is about the measuring of her success. What did she do that changed the world? Because I'm going to use the James Bond example again. In movies, James Bond will literally stop the detonator, the counter that's about to blow up the world, and he'll stop it there and he'll save the world from destruction. That's the James Bond spy thing. Obviously, in World War II, it doesn't come to things like that. We've done so much on this channel about its fine margins. Naval intelligence helps. Ultra helps. This helps. This helps. This helps. So, we're not here to say that Josephine Baker single-handedly won the war for the Allies in World War II, because that's a ridiculous statement. But how do you measure her success? As you said there, she is finding information she's getting is circulating. Even what you said earlier about the fact she's an open and early support of de Gaulle, because the Americans weren't sure which horse to back in the middle part of the war. There are various candidates, and even just the fact that certain American diplomats are saying, well, Josephine Baker likes him, that kind of subliminal effect would have made a difference. So how do you pin down and kind of put a label on her achievements?
Well, I don't know, you know, Paul, I've done a lot of research about women in the resistance, about how women make contributions to the war effort. And of course, it's all relatively recent research in the scheme of things, you know. War has been a very male activity in terms of the way in which we've talked about it for years. And I suppose I sort of feel it's the wrong question.
Yeah.
I feel that what is interesting is to find out, you know, she followed orders. She did what she was told.
Yeah.
She took huge risks.
Yeah.
She engaged. She believed in the war effort.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll ever know exactly the quality of the intelligence she collected and transmitted. We lose sight of who used it and how it was used. She probably didn't even know what a lot of what she was carrying was. I mean, the story is that some of it was written in invisible ink on her song sheets. I think that might have more to do with crime fiction than actual reality, but it certainly could have been coded. There's no reason why she would have known the detail of everything that she communicated, the importance of everything that she related. I mean, she wasn't stupid, and she did collect information that she passed on consciously. But, you know, does it really matter whether or not she, I don't know. I just feel we have to admire their courage. We have to, I just feel that, the value of her intelligence, I don't know if we can ever really get to that. I think intelligence history is a tricky one for that.
It is. And what we can't question is her passionate determination to do her bit, to make the difference she could within her field. And if, you know, it's a sort of a trite comment, but if everybody on the good side of good in World War II had gone above and beyond to her level, we might have won the war by 1943 kind of thing, because she does just do everything she can within her world, within her sphere of influence, which was, as we said, enormous, to do it. And she understood. She was quick to realize the evils of the Third Reich, quick to mobilize what she could do to fight against that. And that's essentially all you can ask of someone, isn't it? You know, she's ahead of the game in terms of a lot of other people in France, in terms of getting their act together. You know, we're still in the age-old debate of how many people were actually in the resistance in 1944. And I'm an absolute Francophile. I live here. I love France, and I'm very proud of the monuments to the resistance and the people who were shot for patriotism in World War II. But it's a very complicated issue, understanding people's you know, exactly when they committed to the cause. But she was an early symbol of the right stuff, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to judge the value of someone's contribution in retrospect, isn't it? We weren't there, were we? So yeah, I think the most important thing is to understand, and yeah, I've tried to uncover as much as I could.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit before we bring it to end about the USA, because I always try and do before these shows what I call the bad research. You know, look at kind of online articles and Wikipedia, and a lot of US journalism, they're claiming Josephine Baker as one of theirs, which it's not that she isn't, but at the time of this, she wasn't American. She, as you say, it wasn't dual citizenship. She'd renounced her American citizenship. She was French. How do you think, I mean, it's a terrible interviewer's question, but how do you think she would feel that in some ways the US have claimed her as hers when she really wasn't? She was French. She became French. She died a French person, didn't she? How do you think she'd feel about American journalists sort of saying, she worked for the OSS, she was American?
Do you know, my honest answer is that she'd be tickled pink. My honest answer, I think she was desperate for recognition in America.
Right.
And I think one of her deepest disappointments was she felt rejected, certainly as a performer. there, and she embraced France. But yeah, look how she leapt on the civil rights cause, and
Yeah.
she went to the March on Washington, and there she was. She turned up in her Free French uniform, her Air Force uniform, with all her medals. People say she really was a very odd sight. And actually, just 2 days ago, someone wrote to me and told me that when she performed soon before her death in 1975, she did some sketches on jeeps, to remind people. And she wore her medals, the medals that she'd acquired during the performance on stage. So, her whole identity was kind of muddled up with this, her sense of Frenchness, her very strong. Yeah, I think she'd have loved the fact that the Americans are trying to claim her as their own. I think, she was transnational. She really belonged to both. She celebrated both sides of her nationality throughout her life, I think.
And I think that is my summary of this, is that, as we said at the beginning, she dominates. She's influential in so many different fields. I mean, that's, I like it when I have a book like yours that I could kind of put it on any one of about 6 different shelves, because it could be in my kind of entertainment kind of Hollywood biography shelves. It could be in with the spying. It could be within the occupation of France. It could be, and that is a testament to the reach she had, is that she participated in these fields, but she also excelled in these fields. I mean, she pushed what performers could do of color in Europe. She pushed that boundary. She helped, she was activist in the 60s in the USA. She fought for the right side in World War II. Pioneering. I mean, it's all the cliches apply, don't they? All the superlatives apply to Josephine Baker. And I think I'm so pleased that she's someone we're still talking about. Was it 50 years after her death, isn't it? I guess now. Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly 50 years after. She died on 12th of April. So yeah, it's exactly 50 years after her death. Yeah. And of course, she was in London too, around the VE Day celebrations. She came and she performed. She performed actually with Noel Coward, and she visited Yorkshire. And she really, I think this 80th anniversary coming up, the celebrations this weekend, she was a really exemplary figure, and I think we need to celebrate not just Josephine Baker, but all those extraordinary people who fought so hard for us to have the lives we have now. It's
absolutely,
it's a moving moment.
And as you said, we can say all that about her, which of course is true, but also there's this slightly complicated nature behind her, and she's not perfect. Very few of the World War II heroes or heroines are entirely without fault, because they are human beings, multifaceted human beings. And as we said, she lived through so many different eras and changes. But yeah, she made a difference, and I think that's important. So, just one last thing about the book. Really, obviously the links are in the description below for those who want to buy it. But obviously you're hoping to get people who are interested in World War II read it, people interested in entertainment, people interested in kind of strong female characters. Is there a particular kind of group of people you think you would benefit from it the most? And obviously this is the World War II crowd here, but is there a particular kind of, you said you wanted to make an accessible book. Is there kind of an area you'd like, you said the UK, is it you'd like British people to understand who she was?
Well, it's also, I think in America as well, there's a lot of interest. Because she is seen much more as a civil rights activist over there. And this is quite a new story for them, discovering.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good story. I think anyone who likes history and likes to have a good read, it's as you say, that there are so many different angles to it. And in particular, I think there is the sources show us how multi-layered she was. She was this great performer, but she managed to use it in so many different ways and use her position and she is a prototype of her kind. I often think of her as one of the first celebrities perhaps,
Yeah.
you know, and the fact, you know, we're so used to the Angelina Jolies and all these other people who adopt children and do great things with their wealth. But she was the first one, as you say. It was innovative.
There's so many areas. She's the first. She's the first
Yeah.
to do this, or if not the very first, certainly in at the beginning. I think that's the important thing. So, well, we will leave things there, Hannah. It's been fantastic talking to you, folks. Gets all serious again tomorrow on World War II TV. We're talking about the liberation of Dachau tomorrow with Erin Faith Allen, which I'm looking forward to talking to Erin. A little bit less excited about the subject because obviously talking about liberation of camps is always very upsetting, but it's an important bit of history. It's her beloved 42nd Division tomorrow. We've got Phil Craig coming back on talking about Indonesia, Dutch East Indies and Vietnam at the end of World War II in 1945, and lots more stuff coming on as always. So don't forget to click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. But in the meantime, I'm going to say good night and thank you for watching, and thank you, Hannah, and thank you for the questions, everybody. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.